As I stand before you today, I cannot help but feel the weight of history which surrounds us and which reminds us of the vital parliamentary traditions to which members of both houses dedicate yourselves with such personal commitment for the betterment of us all. Parliament is the living and breathing instrument of our democracy.
Royal doctors have just confirmed the unthinkable about King Charles, and what they're saying will absolutely shatter you. This isn't another rumor or speculation. This is the bombshell everyone feared. Insiders are calling it the most devastating news in royal history. What happens next will change everything you thought you knew about the monarchy. The world stood still on February 5th, 2024.
When the Queen came to the throne, Britain and the world were still coping with the privations and aftermath of the Second World War, and still living by the conventions of earlier times. In the course of the last 70 years, we have seen our society become one of many cultures and many faiths.
When Buckingham Palace released a statement that no one expected to hear, King Charles III, barely 2 years into his reign, had been diagnosed with cancer. The announcement rippled across the globe within minutes, sending shockwaves through royal circles and leaving millions of people in stunned disbelief. For a monarchy that had spent centuries carefully guarding its secrets, this level of transparency was almost unprecedented. Yet there it was, in plain language, confirming what many had feared but hoped would never come true. The diagnosis itself came as a complete surprise, discovered during what was supposed to be a routine medical procedure. Just weeks earlier, in late January 2024, the palace had announced that Charles would be undergoing treatment for an enlarged prostate. It was presented as a common condition, something thousands of men deal with every year, nothing alarming or life-threatening. The king had even chosen to make the announcement public, hoping to encourage other men to get their prostate health checked. It seemed like a straightforward situation, the kind of minor health issue that would be resolved quickly and quietly. But during that procedure, doctors noticed something else, a separate issue of concern, as the palace carefully worded it. Further diagnostic tests were ordered, and those tests revealed the presence of cancer. The palace made it clear that this was not prostate cancer, which only deepened the mystery and the worry. If it wasn't prostate cancer, then what was it? The palace refused to provide specifics, citing the king's right to privacy, but confirmed that he had already begun a schedule of regular treatments. Public-facing duties would need to be postponed, they said, though he would continue his work behind the scenes, handling state business and official paperwork as usual. The timing couldn't have been worse. Charles had waited his entire life to become king, longer than any heir in British history. He had finally ascended to the throne in September 2022, following the death of his beloved mother, Queen Elizabeth II. His coronation, a lavish ceremony steeped in tradition and pageantry, had taken place in May 2023. He was still finding his footing as monarch, still shaping his legacy, still proving to the world that he could lead with the same dedication and strength his mother had shown for over 70 years. And now, less than 18 months into his reign, he was facing a battle that would test him in ways no amount of royal training could have prepared him for. The public reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Social media platforms exploded with messages of support, concern, and speculation. News outlets around the world ran the story as their top headline. People who had never given much thought to the monarchy suddenly found themselves deeply invested in the health of a man they had watched grow from a young prince into an aging king. There was something profoundly human about the announcement, a reminder that even those born into unimaginable privilege and power are not immune to the harsh realities of illness and mortality. What made the announcement even more striking was the king's stated reason for going public. He could have kept it private, could have followed the old royal playbook of silence and discretion. But Charles made a deliberate choice. He wanted to prevent wild speculation, yes, but more importantly, he hoped that sharing his diagnosis might help others. He wanted to shine a light on the work of organizations that support cancer patients and their families. He wanted people around the world who were dealing with their own cancer diagnoses to know they weren't alone. It was a moment of vulnerability wrapped in purpose, a glimpse of the man behind the crown. The palace statement emphasized that the king remained wholly positive about his treatment. He was grateful to his medical team for their swift intervention, which had been made possible because of his recent hospital procedure. In a way, the enlarged prostate that had seemed like bad news had actually saved his life, or at least caught the cancer early enough to begin treatment. But despite this optimistic framing, the reality was sobering. Cancer is cancer, no matter how positive you try to be about it. And at 75 years old, Charles was entering a fight that would demand every ounce of his strength. Adding to the emotional weight of the situation was the fact that Charles wasn't the only member of the royal family dealing with a cancer diagnosis. Just months after his announcement, Catherine, Princess of Wales, revealed that she too had been diagnosed with cancer. She had undergone abdominal surgery in January, and during that procedure, cancer had been discovered. She would need to undergo preventative chemotherapy, she explained in a deeply personal video message. The double blow hit the royal family hard. Two of its most prominent members, both facing life-threatening illnesses at the same time. It was almost too much to process. For Charles, the early days after the diagnosis were particularly difficult. Those close to him described a man who was deeply moved by the outpouring of support he received. Get well cards and messages flooded into Buckingham Palace from all corners of the world. People he had never met, people from all walks of life, took the time to send their best wishes. During a meeting with then Prime Minister Rishi Sunak in late February, Charles admitted that reading these messages had reduced him to tears most of the time. It was a startling confession from a man who had spent a lifetime maintaining composure in public. But perhaps that was the point. Cancer has a way of stripping away pretense, of forcing you to confront what really matters. The palace released a photograph of Charles sitting at a desk, surrounded by stacks of cards and letters. He looked tired, but determined, his reading glasses perched on his nose as he carefully read through the messages. It was an intimate image, one that felt miles away from the formal portraits and official photographs the public was used to seeing. This wasn't a king performing his duties. This was a human being, grappling with fear and finding comfort in the kindness of strangers. In those early weeks, speculation ran wild about what type of cancer Charles had been diagnosed with. Without official confirmation, rumors filled the void. Some reports suggested pancreatic cancer, one of the most aggressive forms of the disease. Others theorized it might be a blood cancer or something related to his digestive system. The palace remained silent on the specifics, insisting that they would not be providing regular updates on his health or treatment. It was a decision that frustrated many, but also protected Charles's dignity during an incredibly vulnerable time. What we did know was that he had begun treatment immediately. The nature of that treatment, whether chemotherapy, radiation, targeted therapy, or some combination, was never disclosed. What mattered, the palace seemed to be saying, was that he was fighting. He was following his doctor's advice. He was doing everything in his power to beat this disease and return to full public duty as soon as possible. And for now, that would have to be enough. The world would simply have to wait, hope, and trust that the man who had spent 7 decades preparing to be king would find the strength to overcome this greatest of all challenges. The months following the diagnosis became a grueling test of endurance, not just for King Charles, but for everyone around him. Behind the carefully managed public statements and occasional photographs, a much more difficult reality was unfolding. This was a man who had spent his entire life in service, who had built his identity around duty and responsibility, now forced to step back and prioritize his own survival. For someone like Charles, that adjustment was almost as painful as the treatment itself. Those close to the king began to paint a picture of what life was really like during this period. His nephew, Peter Phillips, spoke candidly in an interview about the king's state of mind. Charles was in good spirits, he said, but also hugely frustrated. The frustration wasn't about the illness itself, but about what it was taking from him. He couldn't do everything he wanted to do. He couldn't fulfill all his royal duties. He couldn't be the king he had envisioned himself being. But at the same time, Phillips noted, Charles was pragmatic. He understood that there was a period of time when he needed to focus on himself, to give his body the chance to heal and respond to treatment. Still, that understanding didn't make it any easier. Charles was constantly pushing, always asking his staff, his doctors, his nurses if he could do this or that, trying to find ways to stay active and engaged, despite the limitations his health had imposed. The reality of cancer treatment is that it doesn't follow a predictable timeline. There are good days and bad days, moments of progress and setbacks that come without warning. For Charles, one of those setbacks arrived in March 2025, more than a year into his treatment journey. The palace issued a brief statement explaining that following scheduled and ongoing medical treatment that morning, the king had experienced temporary side effects that required a short period of observation in hospital. The statement was deliberately vague, offering no details about what those side effects were or how long he would need to stay. What it did make clear was that his engagements for the following day would need to be postponed, and that the king deeply regretted any inconvenience this might cause. The hospitalization, however brief, sent a wave of concern through the public. It was a stark reminder that despite the optimistic updates and carefully staged appearances, Charles was still very much in the middle of a serious health battle. The treatment was taking its toll. His body was being pushed to its limits. And while modern medicine had made incredible advances in treating cancer, it still came with a price that had to be paid in physical suffering and exhaustion. Yet even during this difficult period, Charles continued to work. Royal aides later revealed that despite everything he was going through, the king had undertaken 178 official audiences during the financial year that ended in March 2025. These weren't casual meetings or brief handshakes. They included 46 audiences with government and devolved administration ministers, 27 meetings with outgoing diplomats, and 35 audiences with incoming dignitaries. It was a staggering workload for anyone, let alone a man in his mid-70s undergoing cancer treatment. The keeper of the Privy Purse, James Chalmers, described it as remarkable resilience, a demonstration of the king's personal commitment to duty and the adaptability of the royal household in ensuring continuity of service, no matter the personal circumstances. But numbers on a page can't capture what it actually cost Charles to maintain that level of activity. Those who saw him during this time noticed the subtle changes. He moved more slowly. He tired more easily. There were moments when the mask would slip, when the strain would show on his face before he caught himself and straightened up again. During one visit to a cancer treatment center, he spoke with patients who were going through their own battles. One young man asked him about diet and nutrition during treatment. Charles opened up, sharing that it really was about what you eat, that food and diet could help manage the side effects. He asked patients if they were surviving the side effects all right, then added with a weary honesty that you just have to push on, don't you? It was advice born from personal experience, the words of someone who knew exactly what they were going through because he was living it himself. In another encounter, Charles spoke with a patient named Jacqueline Page, who told him she was wearing out. The king's response was immediate and heartfelt. He said he knew that it was a terrible thing, as he was discovering already. That simple exchange, captured by reporters, revealed more about his condition than any official statement ever could. This wasn't a man who was breezing through treatment with minimal impact. This was someone who was genuinely struggling, who understood on a deeply personal level what it meant to feel your body wearing down under the relentless assault of both disease and cure. The type of cancer Charles had been diagnosed with remained a closely guarded secret, but senior royal aides eventually began to share a bit more context. In conversations with journalists, one aide explained that the king was dealing incredibly well with his illness, but also revealed something crucial about the nature of his condition. The thing you learn about this illness, the aide said, is that you just manage it. That's what Charles was doing. Medical science had made incredible advances, and from the aide's perspective, there was genuinely no difference in how the king appeared or functioned. As long as you do what the doctors say and live your life as normally as possible, that's exactly what he was doing. It was a carefully worded statement, but the implication was clear. This wasn't a cancer that would be cured and forgotten. This was something Charles would be living with, managing for the foreseeable future. Reports began to surface suggesting that the palace had accepted this new reality. One significant revelation was that it appeared unlikely Charles would ever move from Clarence House to Buckingham Palace, even after the extensive restoration work on the palace was completed in 3 years' time. Buckingham Palace would remain the household's office and the center of official business. But Clarence House, smaller and more manageable, would be his home for the rest of his reign. It was a concession to his health and advancing years, a recognition that some battles simply aren't worth fighting. Throughout all of this, Queen Camilla emerged as his most steadfast supporter. She stood beside him at public events, often placing a gentle hand on his arm or back, a subtle gesture of support that didn't go unnoticed. She took on additional duties when he couldn't, representing the crown at engagements he had to miss. Behind closed doors, those close to the couple described her as fiercely protective, managing his schedule, making sure he didn't overextend himself, and providing the emotional support he needed to keep going. Their relationship, which had weathered so much public scrutiny over the years, was now being tested in the most private and painful way imaginable. Princess Anne and Prince William also stepped up significantly during this period. Anne, always the most hardworking member of the royal family, somehow found room in her already packed schedule to take on more. William, as heir to the throne, began to assume a more prominent role, appearing at events that would have traditionally been the king's responsibility. The palace presented it as business as usual, but those paying attention could see the gradual shift taking place. William was being prepared, perhaps faster than anyone had anticipated, for the weight of the crown. By July 2025, Charles had reached a point where he felt comfortable enough to offer his own assessment of how things were going. During a visit to Newmarket, he met a cancer survivor named Lee Harmon. When Harmon asked how the king was doing, Charles responded that he was feeling a lot better now, and that it was just one of those things. The casualness of the response was striking. Just one of those things. As if cancer was merely an inconvenience rather than a life-threatening disease. But perhaps that was how he needed to think about it, to minimize it in his own mind so that it didn't consume him entirely. The truth, as those closest to him understood, was more complicated. Yes, he was managing. Yes, the treatment was working well enough to allow him to continue his duties. But the cancer hadn't gone away. It was still there, lurking in the background, requiring ongoing treatment and constant vigilance. He had learned to live with it, to carry it alongside all his other responsibilities. And in doing so, he had discovered reserves of strength he perhaps didn't know he possessed. Not the physical strength of youth, but the deeper, harder-won strength that comes from simply refusing to give up when every part of you wants to rest. As the months stretched into more than a year since the diagnosis, a clearer picture began to emerge about what King Charles's future would actually look like. This wasn't going to be a story with a neat ending, where treatment concluded and life returned to exactly how it had been before. Instead, it was becoming something else entirely, a new normal, shaped by the reality that cancer had become a permanent presence in his life, something to be managed rather than conquered. For a man who had spent decades planning his reign, imagining the legacy he would leave behind, this recalibration must have been extraordinarily difficult. The palace, always careful with its messaging, began to frame the situation in terms that suggested long-term management rather than short-term cure. Senior aides spoke about how Charles had learned to live with his condition, how he had adapted his schedule and his expectations to accommodate the ongoing demands of treatment. One aide told reporters that the king was managing the illness exactly as doctors recommended, following their guidance while maintaining as normal a life as possible. Medical science, they emphasized, had made incredible advances. From their perspective, they saw no difference in Charles compared to before the diagnosis. But that carefully optimistic statement also contained an implicit acknowledgement. The treatment wasn't temporary. It would continue into the future, an indefinite timeline that stretched ahead without any clear endpoint. Reports from well-placed sources began to paint a more complete picture of what that actually meant. Some insiders suggested that Charles would likely die with cancer, rather than of cancer, a distinction that sounds subtle but carries enormous weight. It meant that while the disease would remain in his body, potentially for the rest of his life, it wouldn't necessarily be the thing that killed him. With rigorous treatment, careful monitoring, and the best medical care money could buy, he could potentially live for years, even decades, carrying this burden, but not succumbing to it. For many older individuals diagnosed with certain types of cancer, this has become the reality. Modern treatments could keep the disease in check, could prevent it from spreading or growing, could turn what was once a death sentence into a chronic condition. Royal biographer Angela Levin offered her own assessment during a television appearance, providing what many saw as a more honest appraisal of the situation. She explained that Charles had one of those cancers that wouldn't go away, but that you could actually live for years with it. With the medical team surrounding him, constantly monitoring and adjusting his treatment, he wasn't facing an immediate crisis. He wasn't, as she put it, going down. But she also acknowledged the toll that the ongoing treatment took on him. The regular trips to London for medical appointments, the doctors examining him and checking his progress, all of it was tiring and worrying. It was a burden he would carry for the foreseeable future, one that would shape every decision he made about his reign. The question of succession, always present in royal circles, took on new urgency and complexity. Prince William, now in his early 40s, found himself in an impossible position. His father was still very much alive, still determined to fulfill his duties as king, still fighting to maintain his role. But the reality of Charles's health meant that William needed to be ready, perhaps sooner than anyone had anticipated when his grandmother died in 2022. The transition that everyone had assumed would take years, maybe even decades, now felt compressed, accelerated by circumstances beyond anyone's control. William had already begun taking on more prominent responsibilities, appearing at state functions and international events, where his father might once have been expected. He was being briefed more regularly on matters of state, given more access to the inner workings of government, gradually assuming the weight of what it meant to be heir to a throne that might become his sooner rather than later. But he was also a husband and father of 3 young children, trying to balance the impossible demands of royal duty with the very human need to protect his family from the relentless pressure and scrutiny that came with their position. His wife, Catherine, had her own cancer battle to contend with, though by late 2025 she had announced she was in remission after completing preventative chemotherapy. The relief that came with her recovery was tempered by the ongoing worry about Charles. The relationship between Charles and his younger son Harry remained fractured, and the king's illness had done little to heal those wounds. There were whispers of exploratory discussions about whether father and son could ever be reunited, perhaps at the Invictus Games scheduled for Birmingham in 2027. Some reports suggested that Harry had actually visited Clarence's house in September 2025, pulling up in a car for what appeared to be a meeting with his father. But if reconciliation was happening, it was happening slowly and privately, away from the cameras and the constant speculation. Harry had made public comments expressing concern about how much time his father had left, emotional statements that revealed the complicated mix of love, regret, and unresolved tension that defined their relationship. For Charles, the estrangement with Harry must have added another layer of pain to an already difficult situation, the knowledge that time was precious and some relationships remained broken. By the autumn of 2025, Charles had settled into a rhythm that worked for him. He maintained a carefully calibrated schedule of public appearances and private duties, enough to demonstrate that he was still capable of leading, but not so much that it would compromise his health. He had learned to pace himself, to recognize his limits, to accept help when he needed it. During public appearances, he often looked thinner than he had before the diagnosis, his face more drawn, but his spirits remained remarkably resilient. He smiled, he engaged with people, he showed genuine interest in the organizations and causes he visited. To the casual observer, he might have seemed like any other elderly man slowing down with age. Only those who looked closely could see the deeper signs of what he was enduring. The question of legacy weighed heavily on him during this period. He had waited so long to become king, had spent decades as the longest-serving heir in British history, and now his reign was being defined not by the initiatives he had hoped to champion, but by his battle with illness. Yet in some ways, his decision to go public with his diagnosis, to speak openly about his treatment, to connect with other cancer patients and survivors, had given his reign a different kind of meaning. He had humanized the monarchy in a way that few of his predecessors ever had. He had shown vulnerability, admitted struggle, and in doing so had made the crown feel more accessible, more relatable to ordinary people facing their own battles. In April 2025, Charles attended a cancer support reception and delivered a message that revealed how much the experience had changed him. His diagnosis, he said, had brought humanity into sharp focus. It had shown him the very best of what people were capable of, the compassion and kindness that emerged in the face of suffering. He spoke about finding a life worth enjoying, taking risks, loving deeply, having no regrets, and always maintaining what he called rebellious hope. It was an unexpectedly poetic and deeply personal reflection, the words of someone who had stared down mortality and found meaning in the struggle. The palace continued to insist that regular updates on the king's health would not be provided. They would only address his condition publicly when it affected his working schedule, as it had during the March hospitalization. This policy frustrated those who wanted more transparency, who felt the public had a right to know more about the health of their monarch. But it also protected Charles's dignity and privacy during an intensely difficult period. He was still the king, still entitled to some measure of personal space, even as his illness played out on a very public stage. Looking ahead, no one could say with certainty what the next year or 5 years or decade would bring. Charles would continue his treatment, continue managing his condition, continue trying to be the king he had always wanted to be. William would continue preparing for a role he might assume sooner than expected. The monarchy would adapt, as it always had, to the changing circumstances and the realities of having a sovereign whose health remained precarious. And through it all, Charles would carry on, pushing forward with the same stubborn determination that had defined his entire life, refusing to let cancer take from him the crown he had spent a lifetime earning the right to wear.